Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to tonight's BGA meeting. You are in for a treat this evening, as we have Dan McCrum talking about his best-selling book, which is already out in German under the title House of Wirecard, and is coming out tomorrow in English. It's a tale of whistleblowing courage, journalistic daring-do, financial corruption, and regulatory shortcomings. To chair us in the meeting tonight, we're delighted to welcome Elisabeth Stheeman, who has herself been a director of a number of major German institutions and therefore knows the German financial scene from the inside. Those of you who are joining for the first time, we will be doing this session with Q&A through the question and answer chat at the bottom of your screen. If you have questions, please don't wait until Dan has finished speaking, but feed them in at any point during the meeting. And Elisabeth will then try to chair as many of the questions that you put in as possible. With that, I'll hand over to Elisabeth to chair the meeting.
Thank you, Peter, and also a big thank you to the British-German Association for hosting this event. And I'm so excited about the conversation with you, Dan, and I really look forward to questions from all of you listening. I've been interested in the Wirecard story for some years, in particular since late summer 2020, and it was a bit of an evening like today, very summary. I was sitting in the garden reading the FT magazine, and my jaw literally dropped. It was hard to believe that the story I was reading, a mix of the Jean Le Carré thriller and a James Bond movie, had actually happened. Even more surprising, it had happened in Germany, the country where I grew up and which I associated with reliable and trustworthy business people. I was aware that Wirecard had become the darling of the German stock market. Wirecard had replaced Commerzbank in the highly regarded DAX 30 index and had even surpassed Deutsche Bank valuation in terms of market capitalization before the fraud was finally uncovered, thanks to you, Dan, and to your FD colleagues. We're all looking forward to your insights, Dan. And let me just mention a few themes I'd love you to touch on. How did it all come about? And what kept you going? 7 years, over 100 interviews even after Wirecard collapsed, in addition to the many hundred of interviews while trying to uncover the story all over the world. More than 500 gigabytes of internal Wirecard documents and emails, countless threats of lawsuits, and frankly, also being concerned for your own life and your families. When I was reading the book over the weekend, and I just managed to finish it when coming back from Germany this afternoon, it struck me that the story is much more complicated and uncovering took so much longer than I would have ever imagined. So with that, let me hand over to you, Dan, and we'll come back to questions after you've given a summary of the work you've been doing. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Elisabeth, for that very kind introduction. And yeah, I'm delighted to be able to finally talk to everyone about the story, because as a journalist, you're not supposed to become the story, right? You're supposed to write about other people. And this one kind of picked me up by the ankles and turned my life upside down. So I had no choice about it. And it's sort of one of the joys of putting it all in a book is I can finally sort of reveal all of the crazy things that happened to me along the way. Most of them, which are the sort of things you think, hang on, that shouldn't be happening in real life. So it is indeed great fun to be able to talk about it. And I think the place to start really is sort of the first time I heard the word Wirecard. I was working at the FT for FT Alphaville, and I was sort of looking for companies which things didn't seem quite right, or were maybe up to no good. And this Australian hedge fund manager says to me, "Hey, Dan, would you be interested in some German gangsters?" I said, "Sure, of course. I mean, who wouldn't, right?" But to be honest, I didn't think much more of it. I just sort of jotted the name down, took a look at Wirecard, and it was a funny little company. I honestly, I sort of read its annual report, which is one of the first things you do as a financial journalist if you're looking at a company. And I just couldn't work out what it did. I knew it was something to do with payments, and it described itself as a European PayPal. And what I learned over time was that was kind of the point. It wanted people to struggle to understand it, so it could sort of hide itself in this complexity. And it was a couple of months later, actually, where another hedge fund manager gets in touch and he invites me for a coffee. And he's a very sort of, nervous is probably the wrong word, but a little bit of a shy fellow who looks very like a typical English hedge fund manager, you know, sort of beige cashmere sweater, a little bit of stubble, slightly nerdy. And he lays out in front of me these sort of handwritten notes of what he thinks is going on in Wirecard. And he brought up all these businesses across Asia, and he thought they were up to no good. He thought they were using that to fake their profits, doing some accounting tricks. And it was quite simple, really. Like, the numbers were complicated, but really what it added up to was Wirecard would say one thing about what it was doing. But when he actually went and checked, it was doing something else. The numbers didn't fit. But as I started to write about it, it became clear there was another theory about what was going on. And this one had been floating around for quite some time and had its roots in Wirecard's history, because it had come to life processing payments for porn and gambling. It was known for this. You know, it told investors this. And so people began to say, well, something about Wirecard is too good to be true. But is it because it's a fraud, or is it because it's money laundering? It's processing payments for all sorts of bad things that you might find online. So I wrote a series of stories, and some short sellers came along and attacked Wirecard. And both of these series got like a very thorough airing. And Wirecard responded in a way that was kind of unusual. And this is when we first started to realize that something was up. Because normally companies respond in quite predictable ways. They have PR firms, they're generally on best behavior when they're talking to journalists. It was right from the very beginning, Wirecard said, hang on a second, are you in cahoots with short sellers? Are you trying to manipulate our share price? Now, I realize I've just mentioned that I was actually being informed by short sellers. So, but I was taking their information and then, you know, using it to report, not saying, hey, there's an article coming out next week, you should place your bets. But what seemed to happen was the German authorities sided with Wirecard's view. They started investigating the short sellers. And what people thought was, I guess that means everything's fine, right? And the share price started going to the moon and nothing really worked. And I gave up for a long time. I was supposed to be doing a different job, and it turned out I wasn't doing it very well. I was building a house, had 2 small children, and trying to expose strange little German companies which no one seemed interested in didn't really work. But then everything changed in September 2018, because at that point, Wirecard went into the DAX index. And it became an automatic investment for not only German investors, but investors around the world. And it was being heralded as the next big thing. And everyone lapped it up. It was more valuable than Germany's biggest banks, and it was promising much more to come. But whilst this was happening in Germany, something was happening in Singapore, because a whistleblower got in touch. Well, actually, I say a whistleblower. It was actually the whistleblower's mother. She was this amazing Sikh woman. She was to immigrants in Singapore, and she She'd been forced into an arranged marriage, kicked out her alcoholic husband, and decided to raise their only son herself, whilst working as a banker. And she pushed him forward, and he'd become a very successful lawyer and had got a job at Wirecard. And while he was there, he discovered some odd things. He found that the guy in the finance team was cooking the books, backdating contracts, and finding all sorts of strange reasons to send money out of the company. They were going to spend €2 million on a market research survey, which nobody else knew anything about, even if that wasn't a suspicious amount to spend on market research anyway. So he tells Munich, we've got to do something about this. At which point the whole thing is squashed and he is forced out of the company. But they didn't send him out the door straight away. They said, you can work out to the end of the week. So the next day he came and took copies of all the documents from the internal investigation they'd done. But he was looking for a new job. He was concerned about what he was going to do now that he'd basically been forced to resign. It was his mum who was not going to let them get away with this. So she got in touch and I went to see her and met her son, Pav. And they told me the whole story and presented me with this truck full of internal documents, is probably the best way to describe it. And it's this miraculous thing which happens as a journalist. I had been looking at the outside from Wirecard, trying to work out what was going on. And now I had everything inside. I could sort of wander around. I could follow people's conversations. I'd sort of had entire inboxes of some of the main bad guys. And so I spent 2 months in a bunker in the Financial Times trying to work out what exactly was going on, sort of following threads through email, sort of trying to piece it together. It was like this giant puzzle. And I began to realize that the guy who was behind so much of it is actually the one who's on the wall behind me on the, there. His name was Jan Marsler, and he was the chief operating officer. And he is this completely fascinating character. He's sort of like, on the one hand, completely charming, speaks multiple languages, and everyone talks about his rhetorical ability. He could talk for like an hour on one slide and everyone would be rapt. But he also lived this other life. And when you actually look at what he was doing, he had no idea really about how the business worked. He sort of teeters from one catastrophe to the next, somehow improvising his way through. And he's also making friends with sort of Libyan militias and Russian mercenaries. And as I discovered later, he was sort of leading this life as a wannabe spy. At one point, his friends were ribbing him effectively because he couldn't go on holiday. He used to hang out at a small palace in Munich, and they would say to him, Jan, you can't, why do you even bother going on holiday? Because you only last a day before you start sending emails again. And then the next day you just fly home because there's no point lying in a sun lounger. What is it you want to do to relax? And he says, I want to do something which no one else in the world can. So up pops one of his friends, happens to be a Russian mercenary. He says, well, Jan, I think I can maybe do something which fits the bill. How would you like to go for a stroll around Syria? My friends there have just helped liberate Palmyra from ISIS. So we could go on a sightseeing tour if you like. And so off he flies, getting himself on the radar of at least one intelligence agency in the process. But I didn't realize that at the time. At the time, all I could see was that this guy was always at the edges of things. But when we finally published a story, the reaction was very strange. Now, I don't want to sum it up too brutally, but you could really say Germany didn't believe us. What Wirecard did was it used its same playbook. It said, ignore the Financial Times story. It's not true. And by the way, we think they're corrupt. There was some very suspicious share price movement going on. And to begin with, we kind of thought, okay, it's the same old playbook. But then the German regulator BaFin announces it's actually investigating me and my colleague who've been working with me on the story as well. And we're kind of like, well, that's strange. Well, what we need then is more evidence. We'll just carry on. We'll keep going because Wirecard had sort of made it impossible for it to do that. It was one of their great mistakes. They said, had they just admitted everything and come clean, then we might have declared victory and moved on. But I don't think they really knew how proper companies behaved. And so they said, no, it's not true. These guys are crooks, which meant the Financial Times was like, right, well, we're going to prove that these guys aren't crooks. And so we run off to the Philippines. We find all sorts of strange things. Like my colleague goes to a fisherman's house. Well, she doesn't know it's a fisherman's house. What it's supposed to be is the address of a payments company, which is an important customer of Wirecard. And she knocks on the door and it's opened, and we're quite concerned at what she's going to find. We've sent her with basically a minder and a photographer because the story inside Wirecard is that these partners do all the unsavory stuff Wirecard doesn't want to be associated with. So who might we find there? Are they going to be gangsters? But she knocks on the door and it swings open. And standing in front of her are two men with a white poodle on a table, and they're giving it a haircut. And there's this whole family scene arrayed in front of her, and they're all completely confused. Like, what's this white girl suddenly appeared here doing? And the old fisherman comes out of the house, who is the patriarch, and he's like, no, we've lived here for 50 years. We've got no idea what you're talking about. And then he goes, oh, something did appear in the mail. Hang on a second, what was it? And they go back inside and they come out, and it's a bank statement for this payments company, which is supposed to be at this address at Wirecard Bank with no money in it. And we're like, this is it. This is the golden piece of evidence. This is going to convince everyone that Wirecard is up to no good. But again, it didn't work. Wirecard said, oh, well, we'll sue you. The Financial Times is it's complicated, but basically they came up with a spurious premise to sue us. And everyone focused on the fact that the FT was being sued by Wirecard without really looking at the details of this case. And it was just more stuff from the corrupt FT journalists. And I think you asked about the darkest moment. Well, what happened was I went back to the drawing board. I was like, I've got to get to it. I went back to the files and I'm going through this spreadsheet, which has really the core of Wirecard's business. We can see that it has 3 of these partners and they're very valuable. But I start looking at the customers which they've got. And I'm like, hang on a second. Didn't that one close down? So I start looking up another one. Like, hang on, that one went out of business as well. And I start going down the list and it's sort of like this light bulb moment where it's like, hang on a second. None of it's real. It's like it's all so simple. They've just literally made it up. And so at that point, we're convinced this is it. We're going to kill them. But what they do is they come up with a sting. I send them questions saying, by the way, is your business all fake? As you do as a journalist before you publish a big story. And they come back and say, aha, we have proof you're corrupt. We've got the London nightclub owner talking to the representative of a Far Eastern sheik, telling him that the FT story is coming, they're going to bet against it. And I mean, the nightclub owner is this sort of incredible, charismatic, everyone wants to be his friend kind of guy. And you sort of can't believe it, but it sounded really bad. And obviously Wirecard immediately leaked it to the German press and Handelsblatt starts running it. And the FT says, okay, we've got to call a halt to everything. We've got to do what companies do to clear their name. What started this whole thing? Bring in an outside law firm to conduct an investigation, which we know is going to clear us because we're not corrupt. But in the meantime, that delayed us for 3 months. And I remember the editor, Lionel Barber, telling me, and it was sort of, I knew why he was doing it. And I knew we'd always had his backing, but at the same time, it was like his voice was coming from far away. Because I'd gone from the precipice of like, we're going to get them, to, I think they might win. And I also started to feel quite vulnerable. Because up until that point, there had been threats and there were plenty of sleepless nights. But I kind of assumed that I had a certain journalistic immunity. Like if something happened to me, the authorities would be much more interested than some esoteric financial fraud. But at that point, I started to think, well, if even the FT's investigating and something happens, maybe people will shrug and say, I guess he was in with a bad crowd. And it was while we were doing that, we had started to pick up other hints of what was happening at Wirecard. We'd sort of always known that Jan had these strange friends and claimed sort of spooky connections, but then we learned that he'd been flashing documents for the Russian nerve gas Novichok around London in a sort of strange way to impress speculators that he had important friends, I guess. And so you're like, oh, right, the Russians were involved. Well, that's quite scary. We'd already been operating on the basis that Wirecard was using hackers. When we had conversations, we'd always put phones in the other room. So now it's an extra level of paranoia. And then we started to learn that there were a team of 30 private detectives running around London. And we were able to flip one of them. And he was an ex-policeman, and my editor, Paul Murphy, goes to meet him in sort of this little cocktail bar. And he starts telling him about what's going on. And he says, oh yeah, one thing we thought about, but we've decided not to do, is to plant drugs in your car and then call the police. It's an old gangland trick. And you're kind of like, should I be relieved that they've decided not to do that? Or should I be more concerned that they might actually just totally blow up my lives? But sort of we carry on, and by this point, the editor of the Financial Times has got rather annoyed about what everything is going on. And it felt like it was hand-to-hand combat. And he said, literally, I want a story which is going to draw blood. I want an Exocet missile. And so that's what we did. I put together everything we had. And in October 2019, we fired at the company. This is how they're committing fraud. This is what's going on inside. These are the fake customers. And I think the key thing was, here are all the documents which show what's happening. Judge for yourselves if we're making this up or not. And the amazing thing is, it took another 8 months to die. Now we can talk about that, and there were some truly strange scenes which happened. But what Wirecard did was it was allowed to investigate itself, because that's what happens with companies. So it brought in KPMG to redo the work of the audit firm, which had been signing off and saying everything was fine with its accounts for a decade, EY. And everything came down to 2 pieces of paper. And on these 2 pieces of paper, it said, there's lots of money, almost 2 billion euros, in the accounts at 2 banks in the Philippines. And the reason why we have this strange setup is because Wirecard doesn't have the money itself. It's looked after by this trustee, a lawyer. So all the accountants and the lawyers go to see this man in Manila. And they walk in, and he isn't your typical corporate lawyer that you might imagine a large German financial institution would use. He has a YouTube studio in his office with one of those little plaques saying that he's got 100,000 subscribers. And he uses this to give advice on matters like divorce and other kinds of family law. And it turns out this is the guy who has Wirecard's 1.9 billion euros in his care. And so they go on a little expedition across Manila with some police motorcycle outriders to help them through the traffic. And they go to a tiny bank branch on a street where there's like a bicycle repair shop and other things around, not the gleaming financial district. And they all crowd into this tiny room with the celebrity lawyer. And sort of, there's barely enough room in the branch for them and the staff. There's no customers. And someone jumps up and is like, hello. And they ask about Wirecard. And he looks a bit confused. And then he looks at the celebrity lawyer and he goes, Wirecard. He goes, ah, yes. And produces this envelope, which has a bit of paper which says Wirecard has about 1 billion euros with this bank. and then they repeat the scene somewhere else. And by this point, all those auditors are starting to get a little bit nervous. And so they ask Wirecard to actually transfer some money into Germany. And Jan Marsalek and Marcus Brown keep saying, yes, yes, the money's coming, don't worry, it'll be here, it'll be here. And so this goes on for another 3 months with, I assume, the auditors getting more and more nervous. I mean, I would love to have been in the rooms watching those conversations with that. Has the money come yet? It's very strange, isn't it? Yes, do you think, I wonder what's holding it up. Maybe we should get a payments company involved. Oh, hang on a second. And in the end, Wirecard receives some letters from the chief executives of the banks. And they say, these accounts are spurious. And the first thing which happens is everyone involved has to Google the word spurious because it's quite an obscure English term. And the second thing which happens is all hell breaks loose. And I was sitting in this exact spot. I think it took a couple of days for this bedlam inside Wirecard to finally be announced to the rest of the world. And I was sitting in this exact spot, and we've been waiting because Wirecard had said it had delayed as long as possible, but it said, okay, we will produce our results on this Thursday. And I sat here waiting and waiting, and then the stock market opens and starts trading and nothing's out. You're like, ooh, I think this might go away. And then about 40 minutes later, the announcement comes. 1.9 billion euros is missing. But as soon as I saw that, I was like, that money isn't missing. That money has never going to be seen. And the share price crashed. And it's hard to describe. It's only when the pressure is lifted that you're suddenly aware of how much it was. And it was like this just moment of enormous relief and celebration that it was over, that we had actually done it, and that we could think about something else other than Wirecard. I mean, that was foolish. I then set myself the task of writing a book, but that moment of euphoria was absolutely amazing. I sort of rushed into the kitchen because we were in COVID, obviously, sort of picked up my daughter and sort of span her around, and my kids are looking at me as I'm running around the kitchen like a lunatic going, we won, the bad guys are going to jail. Also, I thought, because it turned out in one last amazing bit of German governmental competence, the chap behind me wasn't arrested. He was allowed to go get on a flight from a small Vienna airfield to Belarus. And well, he hasn't been seen since, and he's thought to be somewhere in the vicinity of Moscow. And what I've done since is to try and write the book to explain, well, how did all that happen and why did it all happen? But I hope that gives you a little taste of the story itself.
Gosh, yeah, thank you, Dan. Amazing on being able to summarize all these things in such a brief period. I mean, I jotted down a few questions and I know others have some too. So between all these different players, I'd be interested in the role of the supervisory board. As you know, I'm very interested in governance, and I sit on various boards too, as many of those who are on the call do. And I know you talk in the book a bit about the structure of the supervisory board. I think certainly some of the people on that were handpicked by Brown.
Yes.
You knew them. And then I think there is the story about how the deputy chair was appointed. Can you just talk a little bit about that and how the supervisory board reacted?
Yes, absolutely. Let me just have a refreshing, hang on. This is no alcohol, by the way. It's not just a... the supervisory board is fascinating. It was a very small board. I mean, I think there are about 6 people total. And so they had no internal committees. And they basically relied on Brown. They trusted him. He was the guy who claimed he had built the company. And they don't seem to have asked tough questions and seem to have bought this line that Wirecard was repeatedly under attack. And so there's So what happens is, Wirecard starts to bring in new people. So they brought in some, actually 3 younger, much more capable and quite well-credentialed women. And in the summer of, when are we, 2019. So the Financial Times has been in this battle with Wirecard for 6 months at this point. And Wirecard's chairman steps down. And what happens is there's a bit of disagreement about who is going to be the deputy chairman. It sounds like such small things, but various people thought that Wolf Matthias had approached them about being the next deputy chairman, and then were surprised when other people thought that they were also entitled to doing this. But this all came to head at this key moment. So there's a hotel on a lake in Austria, which is called I'm going to mispronounce it.
I think
Schloss Fuschel.
Fuschelsee, yes, exactly.
Yes, thank you.
Fuschelsee.
And it's sort of like beautiful ancient hunting lodge. And so they have this meeting sort of in this room overlooking the beautiful lake, except all the, they're in a sort of U shape, they're all facing inwards. And it's a very important meeting because they're having this offsite to discuss the issues at Wirecard. And, some of the allegations about the business, like, where does all its money come from? Why does no one seem to know how any of it works except this guy, Jan Marsalek? So it's a moment, if the supervisory board could have been concentrating, then maybe they could have asked some good questions. They all sit down, and pretty much as the day has begun, this story breaks in Manager magazine. And it casts the whole disagreement over who's going to be the next chairman as this battle between the sort of the money grubbing emotional women on the board and the new incoming guy on the board, Thomas Eichelman, who's quite a volatile character. And you can kind of imagine how that went down. And, in the end, Marcus Brown himself weighs in and gets his friend, Stefan Klestel, who's been on the board for a decade, made the vice chairman. But so at this important meeting, suddenly a PR advisor knocks on the door and says to them, this article has just been published. And they all sit there reading it. And it's clear that one of them must have leaked it, because who else knows about what's going on in these board discussions? And it kind of reminds me of like a moment in an Agatha Christie film where they're sort of at the lakeside hotel, all going, well, who's the guilty one here? Who don't I trust? And obviously they're all seething about what's in this piece, which represents them terribly, or what's going on. And so at that moment, they're not terribly focused at the matter on hand, which is how on earth does Wirecard make its money? And I don't know whether that was accidental or intentional. I mean, it would be pure speculation about who leaked it. But you have that, I think what happens with boards and supervisory boards generally is, you exploit egos and desire for friendship or prominence or status. And then also what you do is you give them something to do. So the ones who were very active, they thought they're in charge of like this whole process to improve governance at the company. They said, yes, there is a problem and please help us deal with it. It was all very effective.
Gosh, yeah, fascinating. I know. Let's move to the regulators. A few questions in the Q&A about that, and it's something which certainly I've asked myself as well. So you mentioned BaFin, that obviously they'd been made aware of some of the things going on and then started to investigate the short sellers. And during the period when you were investigating it, so what happened, and can you share with us, what happened to the head of BaFin and his number 2? And the question also in the chat box was, have regulators learned from this? Could it happen again?
So I think it's very unlikely to happen again in Germany anytime soon, unless there's already a very large accounting fraud in Germany. I think is unlikely to happen anytime soon, because everyone's very conscious of it. There's a certain sort of cycle that you see again and again in finance and business where, you know, you get irrational exuberance, you get all the sort of conditions which make these frauds possible. And then what's the famous Warren Buffett phrase? It's when the tide goes out that you discover everyone's naked, which, or maybe that's not the right one, but yeah, you basically, everybody's alert to the possibility of fraud now, and all the people who have been embarrassed don't want to be embarrassed again. And that includes BaFin, who were quite rightly embarrassed. So Felix, his surname, yes, Felix Hoffeld. Sorry, I was thinking of the Handelsblatt journalist who's also a Felix then. Felix Hoffeld and his deputy both resigned quite some time after Wirecard collapsed, possibly taking the fall for those higher up in the government by doing so. But I mean, there's a particular moment which is disputed, but where, as Wirecard is collapsing, you know, they know the money isn't there and the game is over, but they still have a conversation between Wirecard's chairman and the head of BaFin going, I mean, is it possible this is another short seller conspiracy? These letters from the Philippine banks are very strange. This word spurious, I mean, maybe something's up. And so I think it's, even if that, you know, is overstating how seriously they took it, that sort of blindness to everything, that sort of, I guess, a sort of an institutional decision, because Wirecard investigated, because BaFin investigated Wirecard critics in 2008, and then again in 2016, I think there was an almost, well, if we take these sort of public criticism seriously, then that raises questions about our previous behavior. So at least let's stick to the same approach. But what is very hard to answer, and I don't have an answer for, is there are moments I talk about in the book. There's a chapter which I love on India, because it takes you behind the scenes as the fraud is unfolding. And it's like, you know, we wondered about this deal for ages. Wirecard's biggest deal was this Indian takeover, and it was immediately suspicious. And what I had access to was sort of the internal team chats which they were using to manage this whole sort of fraudulent deal, and also spoke to some of the people who were involved. And one of them told me, you know, he realized pretty quickly that something fishy was up. And so he logged on to BaFin's whistleblowing portal and wrote down everything he knew about it and said, you should really look into this. And sadly, because he was very nervous about being exposed, he didn't keep copies of anything. But obviously nothing happened. And then there's another moment where, to help out the whistleblower before our first big story, I send off dossiers of information to a whole bunch of authorities. So the UK, Germany, India, I mean, there's about 8 or 10 packets. And one of them goes to BaFin. And so they get it. So they get this packet, and then the Financial Times publishes a story, which is clearly based on the same information. And instead of going, aha, looks like there really is a good faith whistleblower here, they go, well, this is very suspicious. Maybe this is part of the conspiracy. So it really seems to be like just a mindset at the regulator.
And whistleblowers, perhaps we could come back to, because I remember also reading in the book that you were called in front of a parliamentary committee in Germany. And I think one of the things you said to them when they said, what should we do differently, or what can we learn, which is also one of the questions in the Q&A, is that protect whistleblowers. And I think you specifically thank them in the book. So yeah, perhaps sticking on the theme of lessons learned. Yeah, in your view, what should business executives, investors and auditors learn from this fraud?
There are, they should have a subscription to the Financial Times. I mean, I think that's the first one, obviously. And,
of course you would say that.
And I think it helps that, you know, our reputation was burnished by it. But I think there's a couple of lessons. One is the initial response to the stories that the FT wrote. So what we printed about Singapore, this investigation, to begin with, the numbers were quite small. The fake contracts added up to about $30 million, 30 million euros. And a lot of investors looked at that and said, well, in the context of a company with 2 billion euros in annual sales, that doesn't seem very material. And Wirecard actively encouraged them to do this. But the mistake was to look at the amounts instead of the practices. What they should have been saying is, what on earth is going on inside a company with 2 billion in annual sales that the guys in the finance team feel the need to do this? Why weren't they all fired immediately? And there's a phrase an American short seller called Mark Cahodes used. There's never just one cockroach in the kitchen. So I think, you know, if a company is lying about one thing, they're probably lying about a lot of other things. Whereas I think investors, auditors, regulators, for various reasons, were looking for explanations. And they would sort of, if something didn't fit, then they would go, well, I guess that just doesn't make sense. I think that's the big overarching lesson. But, you know, I've actually just written a piece for the Financial Times Weekends, which should be appearing on Thursday, I think, you know, about how do these frauds happen. And there's an element which is, they can exist because we have high trust societies. You know, it doesn't actually make sense to go and check everything because most of the time it doesn't need checking. You know, most people are doing the right things. Companies aren't constantly misrepresenting themselves. It's the small minority who take advantage of them. And that's kind of why these frauds are so insidious, because they're sort of abusing the trust inherent in society. And when they're exposed, they erode the trust in all those institutions that we rely on, the auditors, the bankers, the regulators. And that's really the damaging aspect. I mean, we can talk about the money that has been lost, but it's that expense which is sort of more intangible and is the bigger one. And so yeah, I think those are the key lessons.
And I might add to that from my own experience, if you don't understand something, keep asking. But I mean, thinking back to the global financial crisis, when various people were asked to explain things such as CDOs, and then they may not be able to actually explain what they are. So keep asking. Certainly as board directors, and I know you mentioned that in the book as well, I mean, you are in full personal liability. So those are the supervisory board members who quickly try to resign as things then unfolded. It was too late. So their lawyers very clearly said, you can do what you like, but it's not getting you out of the proverbial jail. So yeah, scary stuff. So the German business press. So what happened there? You mentioned Handelsblatt, you mentioned Wirtschaftswoche. So how did they react? And one question somebody asked, I think, when we had the pre-call is, do you have a sense what might have happened if, say, suddenly Handelsblatt were to go for a FTSE 100? Or, I mean, just throwing this out.
I would like to think that if Handelsblatt suddenly started publishing stories about, you know, wrongdoing inside Barclays Bank or Lloyd's, all our editors would be shouting at us to why some German paper got the story, go and get it and go and find out what's going on. I mean, obviously it's trickier if Lloyd's was then turning around and saying these Germans are corrupt. But still, I mean, it was really surprising. And I mean, I put a little bit of this in the book because part of what I wanted to tell is, you know, how the journalism worked and happened, and the mistakes are in there as well, because I don't want it to just be a sanitized account, because also the mistakes did prove to be quite significant. But so we published the story, and you know, it's been treated like fake news. And there's this key document, which is the report from the law firm on their investigation into Singapore, you know, essentially what the whole story is based on. And so we look at some of the Handelsblatt stories, because Handelsblatt is this sort of big, widely read business newspaper in Germany. And so what we do is we slip him the key document to sort of help them out so they can see for themselves. And so Handelsblatt take it and then basically use this as a way to get an interview with Marcus Brown, which they publish. So they basically give Marcus Brown the sort of license to explain away everything, and here's his side of the view, which, I mean, maybe we would have done the same. But to be given that evidence, look, clearly the company is lying about this and it's very serious. And then to sort of spend the rest of the time sitting on the sidelines munching popcorn going, this battle between the FT and the company is great. It's, again, something that I find very hard to explain.
Yeah, and perhaps just sticking with that theme for a moment, I remember when I first heard you speak about this at the German symposium, and I have my mug here because
probably your mug there proudly here.
And I was just totally fascinated by it. And I remember you saying one thing which stuck with me is, if you'd been an independent journalist just doing this on your own, this would have been much harder. And I remember right at the beginning of the book, you talk about this sort of meeting, or rather sort of different meetings with you know, the editor, and with a chief lawyer, with a guy who was heading up the investigations team. Yeah, so what would it have been like if you'd been independent? And then one person also asked, how much of what you did you share with your partner, given that, I mean, you were personally intimidated and probably sometimes afraid to even sort of tell anybody where you lived, or being afraid you might be followed home. And I think some of the people you were working with had that experience. So
yeah, we talk, so on the Financial Times, we wouldn't have been able to do this as an independent journalist, like a freelance, or even probably a small organization, just because, I mean, I sort of put the numbers in there to illustrate it. And so, you know, you have moments where it's like, when I fly to Singapore, I take a 1,000-mile detour via Brunei, so we can save the FT £170. And then as things escalate, you know, it's sort of 10 grand for a QC opinion here, and then it's 100 grand for the lawsuit, and then 160 grand for the internal investigation. And then I have criminal lawyers appointed, which cost €600 an hour. And me and Stefania had to have one each. We weren't allowed to share one, apparently. And so that takes serious resources. And it, you know, and Wirecard successfully intimidated other news organizations. So there's a moment where, I won't go into all the details, but Reuters publish a tremendous investigation about what I call a paperwork factory. It was something Wirecard was using to sort of create corporate identities, it looks like, for money laundering for some of the dubious customers. And Reuters did this whole amazing investigation about it, which got talked about in Parliament. It led the news in the country all day. But under legal pressure, they had buckled and took Wirecard's name out of it. So it seemed like the mastermind of it all was this sort of young, gruff guy from County Durham who had 4 GCSEs. And he said, as he said to me, so you're asking me, who's got 4 GCSEs, if a German bank comes to you and tells you this is how it's going to be, I'm the one who's supposed to say, oh, hang on a second, that's not the right way to do it. But in Reuters telling, he was the bad guy. And so so I think, yeah, it did take a lot of resources. And again, we can thank Wirecard for basically calling the FT's reputation into question. So they made it impossible to walk away from the story. And so costs didn't matter at that point. You know, there was a bigger issue at play. But in terms of like the impact on me and Charlotte, I mean, she was amazing throughout all of it. And she was incredibly supportive. But yeah, there were moments when we were, you know, she would say to me, "Are we in trouble?" And I would sort of say, no. You know, I'm a journalist. It would be terrible. But, you know, there is that nagging feeling in your back of your head. And I would lie awake at night, you know, sort of dreaming about home invasion. I mean, I think I mentioned, you know, I stick a hammer under the bed at one point because that's the sort of stupid thing you do. You don't know what else to do.
And I think you talk about, was it Indonesia, where I don't know how many journalists, was it Indonesia?
Oh, yes. So I talk about this incident. So the reason, I'll tell you why I put that in the book as well. So when Stefania goes to the Philippines on her reporting expedition and she finds the fishermen, I talk about, so the Philippines is one of the most dangerous places in the world to be a journalist.
Apologies, it was Philippines.
Yes, it's the Philippines. And journalists are regularly killed, but there's this particular incident in so the noughties, I think. I think it was about 2009 or 10, where there was an election going on and there was some sort of violence attached to the election. So the female candidate for mayor or governor had to go file some papers, and she'd been warned that it was dangerous. So what she sort of did is sent members of her family and a whole bunch of supporters with this entire troop of 20 or 30 journalists, assuming that a big group like that would be safe. And the tragedy is that it turned out they weren't. They were met essentially by a militia who took them off to a nearby hillside, and they were found, they were all, like the entire group was found in this large mass grave. And the reason why I put it in the book is because the year it happened, I went to a big function for the Society for the Protection of Journalists in New York. This is when I was a reporter in New York covering hedge funds and things. And I vividly remember we're all sort of sitting there at this black tie event, and they're talking about this thing happening and, you know, journalists being killed around the world. And you kind of feel, well, we've got some pretty cushy jobs here and we're not really dealing with things at the sharp end. And I also wanted to put it in to sort of say, yeah, all of these sort of threats and things happen to me, but, you know, there are some journalists who face genuine peril on a daily basis, and there are journalists getting killed out there. So please don't put me on any sort of pedestal. Like I mostly spent my time running around in offices.
Well, thank you. And there's so many more questions, and apologies to all of those. These questions I couldn't pick up, but there's one final one, which actually I had on my list as well. How about a film? So any of us who've seen The Night Manager or other Jean Le Carré, you know, films. I mean, this cries out to be an amazing thriller film.
I mean,
has anybody approached you? We all hope that you make sure that you get the rights to the film.
Oh well, yes. There's you know, well, we're making a documentary has been made and will be appearing in the autumn on a streaming service you may be familiar with. And who knows? I mean, it would make a cracking film or even series. There are so many crazy characters. I mean, like there's whole parts of it with like the weirdos who we haven't even touched on, like, you know, the lunatic racing driver who lives in the world's tallest building, or the short seller who with the imaginary friend, allegedly, maybe, who he claims completely definitely does exist. So there's all sorts of fascinating things.
And I'm actually really glad that at the beginning of the book you have a list of characters, because I had to go back and forth quite often, and that's when actually a printed book, and thank you for sending me an early copy, is actually quite useful, because I could quickly look, was this a crook, was it an informant, who did they work for, where were they based? So anyway, well, I'll leave it at that, and just to say a huge thank you, Dan, for being so open, for spending the time with us, actually for writing the book, which, as Antonia put in the chat, is out both in German, has been out already, and I think it's coming out in English this week.
Yes, it's out in English. Money Men, there's one behind me, there's one behind you.
The one behind me, exactly. And yeah, and thank you for your fascinating insights, and thank you to Peter and the British German Association for hosting this.
Well, let me just add my thanks to both of you. Dan, that was really fascinating. Even having read the book in German, it was great to have your exposition of it. And I look forward to the film. Perhaps you'll play yourself in the film when it comes out. Elisabeth, thank you very much to you two for chairing tonight. For those of you who would like to hear more of Elisabeth, she's actually coming back to a BGA event on green finance on the 13th of July, hosted by Rafa. And coming up soon, we also have our Parliamentary Day Lunch with David Lammy next week, a grill Abend, and our annual general meeting on the 11th of July. So for anyone who is not yet a member of the British German Association, please do join us, which you can do so very easily on our website. But it just remains me to thank again our two speakers this evening, and to thank you all in the audience for joining us tonight. I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening, and goodbye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.